The photograph was so ordinary, it almost felt insulting to hold it with clean hands. A thin strip of an alley, brick walls sweating winter damp, cobblestones glazed like old teeth. No landmark, no celebration, no tragedy staged for the lens, just the kind of back passage a city keeps for its deliveries and its mistakes. It came out of a small estate box in New England, the kind that smells faintly of cedar and coal dust even after a century. A local picker, Eddie Russo, the patient kind who never throws out bad photos, bought the lot for the frames, not the contents. Inside were hymn cards, a cracked baby rattle, and a bundle of prints tied with fading twine. Most were family scenes, porch steps, stern faces, a picnic that looks like it was held in silence. Then this alley. On the back, in pencil that had gone pale with age, 1914, rear of print set. No first name. No reason. When Eddie scanned it for resale, the image resisted him. The shadows were dense. The far end of the alley dissolved into fog. It was a photograph made without drama, except that early cameras have a way of recording what people don't know they're confessing. The gas lamp in the frame burns like a small moon, and the wet stones throw back its light in thin, nervous lines. There's a coal chute near the ground, crates stacked as if someone fled mid-task, a handcart with one wheel crooked. And then, mid-right, at the edge of what most people would call the nothing of the photo, a child. At first, the child looks like a trick of contrast, a small figure half-turned, swallowed by oversized wool, a flat cap pulled low, boots scuffed white at the toes. The child is not centered. The photographer didn't aim for them. That's what makes the presence feel accidental. And because it feels accidental, it feels honest. Next to the child, only an adult's sleeve and hand, cropped off at the shoulder, as if the picture itself didn't want to show the person holding the leash of that moment. Eddie did what anyone does now. He zoomed. He enlarged the child until the grain became snowfall. And that's when the photograph stopped being harmless. On the child's left wrist, peeking from beneath a frayed cuff, there's a tag tied on with string. Not a ribbon, not a keepsake. A tag, flat, rectangular, meant to survive handling. The ink stamp is dark and utilitarian, slightly smeared as if pressed in haste. COS. BO 47. The letters don't look like someone's initials. They look like an office. They look like a system. Eddie sent the scan to a friend who actually reads the city the way some people read weather. Mara Caldwell, a volunteer at a neighborhood historical society, the kind of person who can tell you what a street smelled like in 1910 because she's lived inside the records long enough to dream in them. Mara stared at the tag for a long time and then did something that changed the tone of the entire conversation. She didn't say creepy. She didn't say haunted. She said softly, like she was trying not to wake someone, "That looks like a placement label." In 1914, placement could mean mercy. It could also mean paperwork strong enough to separate a child from their name. Boarding out programs, charity societies, children's aid committees, some were sincere efforts to keep kids out of brutal institutions. Others were pipelines that turned poor children into tidy solutions. Farmhands, housemaids, bodies moved away from the city so the city could pretend it had cured itself. The tag on the wrist doesn't tell you which version you're looking at. It only tells you that someone, somewhere, had decided the child could be reduced to code. Mara pulled out an old street directory for Boston's North End and traced Prince Street with her finger as if she could feel the cobbles through paper. She noted the proximity of churches, mission houses, a relief office listed in tiny print. Then she noticed the worst part. The alley in the photo wasn't the kind of place you walk through by accident in winter. Not with a child, not with purpose. It was a back route, used when you didn't want attention, used when a front door asked too many questions. That's when the first theories arrived, each one plausible, each one heavy. A child being transferred from a tenement to a temporary home. A child being escorted to a hearing. A child being delivered like a file. The adult's cropped hand became a kind of cruel punctuation, present enough to show control, absent enough to avoid blame. And the question that formed between Eddie's scan and Mara's directories was simple in wording, brutal in implication. Who stamped COSBO 47 onto a child's wrist in 1914, and where was that child being taken? The photograph gives one more detail if you look long enough. The tag isn't neatly tied. The string bites into the cuff line. It suggests movement, impatience, a job done quickly in a hallway or at a desk, the child standing still because they were told to. That tiny discomfort, the way the label sits like it belongs, was the trigger, not a ghost story, a bureaucratic one. Because if a child could be tagged in that alley, then the alley wasn't empty. It was part of a route, a handoff point in a city's quiet machinery. If this detail is making you feel the same cold I felt, leave a comment with what you think those letters meant, and softly, like, subscribe, and comment so we can keep pulling at the threads without looking away. Mara's first move was to treat the photograph like evidence, not atmosphere. She asked Eddie for the raw scan and the physical print, and when he brought it in, gloved, careful, almost embarrassed by how small it was, she held it under a desk lamp the way a jeweler holds a stone. The black and white surface had that old gelatin sheen, the kind that catches light in a thin wave. Along the border, faint scratches ran like dry riverbeds. Nothing screamed forgery. Nothing screamed important either. That, Mara said, was the problem. Systems love small, forgettable things. She digitized the tag area again, higher resolution, then pushed the contrast until the child's coat became a wall of grain. The stamped letters stayed stubbornly legible. COS, BO 47. Under magnification, the ink wasn't fountain pen ink. It was the dull, slightly blotched look of an office stamp, the kind that lives on a lanyard or a chain, the kind that hits paper all day until the edges of the letters soften. Eddie wanted the abbreviation to mean one thing: a charity, a rescue, a hand reaching down. It was easier to imagine that the wrist tag was the beginning of a better story. Mara didn't argue. She simply started listing what the letters could stand for in 1914 Boston, and with each possibility the room got quieter. Charity Organization Society was the obvious one, part of a whole movement that believed poverty could be managed with visits, moral evaluations, and carefully rationed help. BO. Could be boarding out, it could be Boston office, it could be something as banal as branch office. And 4747 was the part that made Mara's eyes narrow. Numbers like that were rarely decorative. They were used for counting and control. They went hunting where names go to die. Old minutes, directories, ledgers, notices written in the calm voice of authority. The Historical Society had city directories and ward maps. The public library had microfilm. The municipal archives had a calendar of committee records that looked like it had been typed by someone who hated hope. Mara called a city archivist she trusted, a man named Simon Kearns, who spoke like he was always in a quiet room, even when he wasn't. Simon didn't laugh at the idea of a child's wrist tag. He sighed, the way you sigh when you recognize a familiar shape of harm. COS shows up in a lot of paperwork, he told her, but not always the way people think. He pulled references to charity visits, to relief cases, to referrals between churches and private committees. Some entries were neat and paternal, others were just brutal in their politeness. A family described as shiftless, a mother described as not suitable, a child described as placed, Not placed like a cherished object on a mantel, placed like a problem moved off a desk. Mara tried to find B.O. in the same handwriting universe. She combed through newspaper classifieds for boarding notices, scanned columns about child welfare debates, and found a handful of mentions of boarding out as a policy, cheaper than institutions, framed as wholesome, sold as reform. The language around it was soft: fresh air, moral homes, country life. But the mechanics were hard: transfers, inspections, removals, reassignments. And the more Mara read, the more she kept returning to the alley in the photograph. Prince Street didn't feel like a front entrance to anything. It felt like the route you take when you don't want a mother to follow. They found something that should have been a triumph and instead became a knot. In a set of charity reports from the era, scattered, incomplete, the kind of record that survives by accident, Mara located an index of cases referenced only by number. Case 47 existed, but the date didn't match. In that bundle, 47 was associated with a visit logged 2 years earlier, and the notes, what few there were, mentioned a different neighborhood entirely. Eddie seized on it. "So it's not that," he said, relief edging his voice. "The stamp could be something else." Mara didn't share the relief. "Or," she said, "it's exactly that, and we're looking at a system that reused numbers, shifted categories, or kept parallel books." Parallel books. The phrase sat between them like a cold cup. Simon Kearns added his own complication. Records for private charities were often not city property. Some were kept by churches, some by successor organizations, some were destroyed deliberately to protect reputations, and some simply vanished in moves, floods, fires, history's quiet shredders. "If you want the truth," he said, "you may need to catch it sideways. Court dockets, coroner's inquests, school attendance ledgers, anywhere the state brushed up against the child." So Mara went sideways. She searched juvenile court calendars for that week in 1914. She checked school committee reports for boarding out references. She looked at census fragments for Prince Street addresses that listed unusually high numbers of boarders with no kinship noted. Every lead turned into 3 more leads, and the child in the photograph stayed anonymous, still half-turned, still held by a cropped adult hand. Then, late one evening, Mara noticed something she hadn't wanted to see. The tag didn't sit on the wrist like a keepsake label, it sat like intake. The string wasn't tied with care, it was cinched. The cuff beneath it looked slightly compressed, as if the tag had been put on recently, over layers, without removing the coat. A hurried job, a hallway job, a desk by the door. And there was another detail, small enough to miss until your eyes were tired. On the tag, beneath the bold stamp, a faint second line, either a clerk's pencil mark or the ghost of a previous imprint, seemed to curve like a letter that wasn't meant for strangers. Mara enlarged it until the pixels broke apart, and she felt that old shift in her stomach. The one that means the story just changed shape. Because if there was handwriting under the stamp, it meant someone might have written something the system didn't fully erase. If you're still walking this alley with us, like and subscribe, and comment with what you think that faint pencil mark could be, because sometimes a single guess keeps a child from becoming only a number again. Mara printed the enlargement on matte paper and pinned it to a corkboard like a crime scene still, then circled the tag with a pencil until her hand hurt. Under the bold stamp, that faint curve refused to become a letter until she stopped trying to read it like a word and started reading it like a habit. Clerks wrote in shortcuts, inspectors wrote in fragments. People who were paid to classify children didn't waste ink on poetry. She tilted the print, changed the light, and suddenly the ghost line looked less like one stroke and more like two. A tall loop, then a quick slash. Not M, not W, more like R. followed by a number that could have been a 12 or a 17. The kind of notation you'd scribble when you were copying from a ledger when you only needed enough to find the row again. Eddie, watching her, said something he regretted as soon as it left his mouth. "Maybe it's just a smudge. Maybe we're making it bigger than it is." Mara didn't look up. "That's what the stamp is for," she said. "To make everything else look like a smudge." They went back to the physical print. Mara ran a soft brush across the surface to lift dust, then used a loupe to look for indentations in the emulsion, any sign that a pencil had pressed into the paper. There was, barely, a shallow groove beneath the stamped letters, like the memory of a hand. That meant the writing had come first, the stamp had come after. Someone had written something personal, something locating, and then the office had covered it with code. Simon Kearns suggested a trick. Compare it to other handwriting from the same ecosystem. Not signatures on marriage certificates, those were careful. Not newspaper ads, those were typeset. He meant the quick, tired pencil of public work. Mara pulled juvenile court dockets, school attendance notes, charity visitor logs. A pattern emerged in the way clerks formed their capital R. A tall loop, then a slash. The same shape as the ghost line. By midnight, Mara had a list of places within walking distance of Prince Street in 1914 that began with R, homes, missions, refuges, relief offices. Most were not named with the cruelty they practiced. They were called homes, asylums, lodges, and one of them, listed in an old directory with the bluntness of a street number, sat uncomfortably close. R, Home, North End Branch. The full name was hard to pin down because the organization had changed titles over the decades, like a snake shedding skins, but the branch address stayed. The next morning, Mara and Eddie walked the neighborhood with the photo in hand. Prince Street had been scrubbed clean by time, dressed up for tourists, but the alley lines still existed, narrower now, fenced, the bricks repointed. Mara stood where she guessed the photographer had stood and felt the draft that always lives between buildings. "If this is the route," she said, "it's not for errands, it's for transfers." Transfers. The word sounded medical until you remembered it applied to a child. They found the strongest lead not in a charity archive, but in a building permit file, dry paperwork that had no reason to lie. On the adjacent block, a property had been modified in 1913 with an added rear entrance for service access. Not a main door, a back door. The kind of door you could use without drawing a crowd. The file listed the applicant, a committee name that matched the rhythm of the stamp. Organized, respectable, sanitized. Mara called every successor institution she could locate. Church offices, social service non-profits, diocesan records rooms. Most answered with polite confusion. Some didn't answer at all. One receptionist, hearing boarding out, lowered her voice as if the word itself could be overheard and punished. "Those records," she said, "are complicated." Then she offered a number for an off-site storage manager who spoke like he'd spent years telling people no. But no wasn't the end. No was a corridor. A week later, Simon called Mara back into the archives. "I found something sideways," he said. He slid a thin folder across the table, a coroner's inquest index for 1914, North End cases. One entry had been penciled and crossed out, then rewritten in a different hand. The subject line read, "Minor child, identity uncertain, brought by attendant." The location line mentioned a rear entrance on a street that intersected Prince. It wasn't proof. It was worse than proof. It was proximity. Mara stared at the index and then back at the photograph. The child's face, still half-shadow, suddenly felt like an accusation. Inquests happened when something had already gone wrong, An illness, an accident, neglect given a legal title. If a child tagged like that had brushed against an inquest, then the stamp wasn't just a label for relocation. It might have been a label for liability. Eddie did another thing people do now. He posted a cropped version of the wrist tag, just the tag, not the child, on a local history forum. He expected noise. He didn't expect recognition. A retired social worker replied first, cautious, almost angry. Looks like boarding out coding. KOS used that kind of shorthand. Then, hours later, a second reply from someone with a family name that sounded old in Boston. My grandmother worked as a visitor. She called it the numbers. Kids were case numbers. Homes got abbreviations. The back doors were for handoffs. And then came the message that made Mara's skin go tight. A private note from a man who said his great-aunt had been boarded out in that era. He'd inherited a tin box of papers. Inside, he wrote, was a receipt card with an office stamp, COS, and beneath it, in pencil, a letter and a number, R12, written in the same impatient curve as the ghost line under the child's wrist tag. The detail in the photo hadn't only changed shape, it had found an echo. If your chest feels a little too tight right now, I understand. Leave a comment with what you think R12 might stand for. And if you can, like and subscribe and comment so this doesn't slip back into the cracks where it was meant to stay. The storage manager's name was Wallace, and he spoke like every sentence cost him something. He didn't deny the era or the organization or even the stamp. He denied access. We don't release child material, he said, as if the children were still stored on shelves, still classified, still locked behind policy. Mara didn't argue the ethics first. She argued the mechanics. The records were more than 100 years old. The names were either dust or descendants, and the photograph wasn't asking for voyeurism, it was asking for context. What finally moved him wasn't outrage, it was embarrassment. Bring what you have, he said. Let me see the code. In a windowless room that smelled of cardboard and disinfectant, Mara laid down 3 things: the original print, the high-res tag enlargement, and the forum message showing R12 on a receipt card. Wallace studied them the way an old clerk studies handwriting, less with the eyes than with memory. Then he did the smallest, most devastating gesture. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a laminated reference sheet, yellowed at the corners, titled simply Transfer Abbreviations. Not a legend for a map. A legend for human movement. COS is what you think, he said. They partnered with a lot of committees. He tapped BO with a blunt fingernail. Boarding out. Then he slid down the list until he found the line that made the air feel thin. RH. Receiving home. Rear entrance. Code 12. Receiving home. The phrase sounded gentle until you pictured an intake hallway, until you pictured coats not being removed because time was short, until you pictured a child kept standing while a tag was tied on over wool. Code 12, Wallace explained, wasn't a route number or a neighborhood, it was a door, a specific rear service entrance used for transfers to reduce congestion, as the old note put it. Congestion meaning witnesses. The alley in the photo wasn't scenery, it was infrastructure. Wallace disappeared between shelves and returned with a ledger that had been rebound so many times it looked like it had survived on spite alone. Inside were columns: date, case, originating address, receiving code, disposition. No lullabies, no descriptions of fear, just the clean, confident handwriting of administration. Mara watched his finger travel down a page until it stopped. Case 47, the same number on the wrist. The entry was dated within days of the penciled note on the photograph's back. Origin address, a Prince Street tenement. Receiving, RH, rear, 12. Disposition, boarded out, conditional. And then, there, in a smaller hand, squeezed into the margin like an afterthought that refused to die. A name. Not a full name, not at first. Just Thomas J., with a last name that had been corrected once, the original scratched out hard enough to scar the paper. Wallace leaned closer, and for the first time his voice softened. "That correction," he said, "means someone didn't know how to spell it, or someone didn't care." Mara felt anger rise, bright and useless. Eddie, standing behind her, made a small sound, like he'd been holding his breath since the day he bought the estate box. The ledger didn't tell them where Thomas went, boarding out scattered children like seeds in wind, some into decent homes, some into quiet servitude, some into places that wanted hands more than hearts. Conditional meant monitored, inspected, revocable. It meant your life could be reclassified at any moment. They tried to follow Thomas the way you follow a paper boat down a gutter, by catching it when it snags. Mara searched school attendance ledgers for a Thomas with that corrected surname. She found a boy of the right age who appeared in one term, then vanished. She searched juvenile court notes. Nothing. She searched census lines for farm families listing an extra border child with no relation. Too many. A system built to move children also built itself to blur them. And yet the photograph gave them one mercy the ledger never intended. The estate box, Mara realized, hadn't held random prints. It had held a family's quiet record. She tracked the box's origin to a woman who'd died without children of her own, a woman whose maiden name matched the corrected surname in the ledger, close enough to make the hairs on Mara's arms lift. A sister, maybe. An aunt. Someone who had kept the alley photo because it was the last proof that Thomas J. had stood in the world, still wearing his own coat, still within reach. The grand revelation wasn't a hidden monster. It was a hidden procedure, a rear entrance, a receiving home, a boarding-out pipeline dressed up as rescue. The wrist tag wasn't meant to be cruel, it was meant to be efficient. And that was the cruelty, how easily care becomes logistics when the people being moved are poor enough to be invisible. Mara wrote Thomas's name in the Historical Society Index anyway, with an asterisk and a note about the code sheet. Not as a solved ending, but as a refusal. Eddie framed a copy of the alley photo with the tag enlarged beside it, not as decor, but as a memorial to a child who was almost filed away completely. If you felt something reading this, say it out loud down in the comments, and in the same quiet breath, like subscribe and comment, so the next small forgotten photograph doesn't have to beg to be seen.